Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to Lily James, who is actor and producer of the movie Swiped. And, starting off, I wanted to talk about your involvement as a producer because initially you were sent a draft of the script and really connected to this story of Whitney Wolfe Herd, but felt like it was really important for you to be involved as a producer. And I love how early you came on board as well. And so I was really interested in what a lot of the conversations and continued story development was as that script continued to develop as a producer.
Yeah, it's so funny the story of movies and how they come to be. And Jen Gibger, our producer, had been, I think it's been 7 years in the making, her telling the story. I think initially when she started developing this story, it was quite different because even the moment that Whitney had with Andre Andreev later when she was building Bumble with this Forbes article revealing some behavior at Badoo, that hadn't even happened yet. So then she kind of, as she developed the story, the kind of Whitney's story grew. Um, However, when I came on board, um, yeah, I was just I felt with this, I was very compelled to by the story. I found it incredibly moving on both a sort of professional and personal level, Whitney's journey. Um and I had been simultaneously building a production company and sort of really exploring the stories I would want to tell and kind of this our remit is stories of female resilience. And this very much played into the stories I was wanting to explore anyway from inception within my company. So with this, being able to come on board as a producer was a huge learning curve and has taught me so much about how I want to move forward in terms of producing stuff from inception onward. And with this, we did a lot of drafts of the script. I mean, it was really fully there in its form. But I was able to work together with the writers to and 20th Century and Hulu and Disney to sort of finesse some of the storytelling and lean into ideas we all collectively, once the team came together, wanted to kind of maybe delve in deeper. Um, and then the casting process and, heads of department, all of those conversations, which were really exciting to be a part of and be let into those decisions.
No, it's really wonderful, and also in playing Whitney in this film, I know how much you always love the preparation and the research that goes into any character, especially when you're playing someone that is a real person. And obviously, Whitney isn't able to be involved in the making of this because of an NDA. So it was very much looking at resources available in the public domain. And I was curious about, kind of stepping in and looking at the research that the rest of the team had already been involved in writing that first early draft of the script, and then really diving on the internet and finding so many other pieces for yourself as well that were going to be helpful.
Yeah, the research team had done an incredible job building this story. And going through everything, the wealth of information in the public domain alongside court documents and really being able to build a full picture of Whitney Wolfe's journey for our dramatization. Um, and for me, the preparation and kind of responsibility I think I had was then to really just sort of look at how I would play her as an actor, take her on as a real person, but then ultimately as a role, as a character that I then had to sort of draw as much as I could, watching her and, incessantly watching her podcast. She does an amazing masterclass, reading articles. I would notate everything, and so that I could speak along with her in my ear, because there was a pace and a rhythm and an energy to how she speaks. She has clearly a mind that's working a million miles an hour. She's always connecting dots, and there's such conviction and clarity of thought. And I wanted to really kind of try and capture that energy, that life force, and then simultaneously sort of bring myself to the role and my own experiences and develop a character, because so much of this was in the end a lot of artistic interpretation and a collaboration between the filmmakers and the writers and everyone.
I love what you were describing just there as well about just the speed of thought that you were kind of really picked up that she has, because I feel like that really comes through in your portrayal of her, but also the fact that she's always, kind of thinking 10 steps ahead and thinking very much outside of the box. So even the opening of the film, when she's crashing a tech event, she doesn't have her own ticket, but she finds a discarded badge. And then she's like, well, if I pick up a glass of wine, it's going to look like I was already in here.
Mm.
And I was interested in how you found all these little external details that helped you to portray the way that her internal mind is just always
Mm.
running.
Yeah, you have all these clues to who she is, and it's all through behavior. And I really liked that opening. There's like a sense of her ingenuity and her kind of tenacity and kind of grit that was really palpable, especially because she was such a, she was so young. She just left college. To have achieved so much at such a young age was something that I found profoundly impactful. Um, and so. Yeah, I mean, there were so many different versions of the script as well and different edits. I mean, I felt like for me personally, I sort of one of the challenges I faced and recognized was trying to tell such a big story in, over the course of 10 years in a kind of movie of an hour and 50 minutes. And sometimes I felt kind of up against that because I didn't want to rush beats. I wanted to like, and as I got deeper and deeper into my research and became more and more kind of in awe and admiration of Whitney's journey and the roadblocks she faced, the challenges, the adversity. Some of that we weren't able to even include in our story because there just wasn't time, and there was legal restraints involved with it too. But for example, in the building of Bumble, that was really, we only had the space to kind of show that in a montage section, but really what that was and what she had to go through to get that company off the ground. She had to move mountains, and from what I learned and read, so I mean, her story is so inspiring, and I think we all collectively did our best to try and bring that to the screen in a kind of in a movie length time.
And also to your point about when we first meet her and she's just out of college, there's a point where she's talking about an app that she created herself while she was still at college. And it was very much focused on nonprofits and
Yeah.
connecting volunteers to them and the work that she'd done after the BP oil spill.
Mhm.
And I was interested in kind of like how you tapped into that side of her that always wants to be very mission driven and connected to things as it stepped into the world of dating apps and relationships and what she really felt like she could bring to the table in that regard.
Yeah, I think that was a sort of a story arc that was inspired by and kind of created as well through our writer because I kind of really connected to that. When you're young, you have this like idealistic, youthful kind of drive. I'm going to change the world, and all of that stuff that I recite as Whitney at the beginning, what she did at college and her startup, and that was all true. There's clips of her explaining that. Um, and then I guess there was a sort of journey here that we wanted to explore as like, as you move through your 20s in business, particularly in like a very male dominated space, like the tech world isn't indicative of a lot of industries, honestly, but in our world, in the tech space, like, how much are you willing to compromise in order to have success? And if your ambition is that great along the way, sometimes you start losing sight of maybe why you were there in the first place. And so there's a journey, I think, of that we created for Whitney, for our version of Whitney, that she kind of along the way gets so kind of sucked into this world, that's this app, particularly this dating app that's moving like the speed of light, and it kind of takes a beat for her to recalibrate going through this huge adversity and an experience in leaving Tinder, that you then come back to yourself. What do I really want? What is my mission? And I think sometimes through great adversity, that becomes crystal clear. And it's good to remember that when we're experiencing those dark times, which we think might be crippling, actually in there, there's light. In there, there's the opportunity to really focus on what you have to say in the world and make a difference, not just for yourself, but those, for Whitney, women and young girls and generations to come. And so there was a beautiful character arc there that I loved exploring.
I think you're so right. And you also touched upon this other point about how often Whitney is the only woman in a room, even when she talks about her computer engineering class where she was the only female student in her entire class back then.
Mm,
And again, kind of going back to that opening, the way that some of the men talk to her, is completely inappropriate. And she just very much internalizes it and doesn't respond. And,
mm.
that also becomes her MO of survival a little bit for certain instances at Tinder. And so as you started to look at the arc and certain things that people would say or direct towards her, how did you find the moments and the beats where you really felt like she's just going to internalize this because it's actually not going to serve her to react in the moment?
Right. I think it's incredibly relatable. I mean, what you just explained, I think you'd be hard pushed to find anyone that hasn't felt that way. And particularly, as you say, as a woman in a space that's all men. And I think one of the lines in the boardroom that I really thought was so kind of impactful and actually really wanted to make sure that was kept in the edit was when Sean says, let's just be practical, not emotional. And you know that that coming to a woman is just such a dig. It's such a and again, you're like, how much am I gonna put up with sacrifice, compromise on to get ahead? Because sometimes it's just not worth it to fight every battle. I could lose my job, I could get axed, I could. So all these conversations that are so important and rich that we need to be continue to have about work dynamics and gender politics and gender equity. So it's all really rich, and we wanted to explore that in a kind of um in the most authentic way we all felt we could, you know.
And there's a scene where Whitney brings forward to her fellow co-founders the idea that women are having a lot of issues on the app and don't necessarily feel safe. And, the way that each person responds in the room is very different. And it's interesting to see the fact that when they want to try to figure out how to frame the narrative, that she actually is the one to come up with the idea. But you
Mm.
can see that she feels really conflicted, whereas they're excited at the idea of, okay, well, we figured out how we're going to frame it, so it's not a problem anymore. And I was just wanted to ask about, that element of conflict feeling really important to that scene, especially for what comes later for her.
Yeah, I guess I loved the conflict in that scene too, because it's like she's this again t tapping into the speed of at which her brain works and she can problem solve and figure out the solution, but that comes at a cost because she's, you know. So I really again, anything you can play as a character or any issue you can explore and look at the nuance to me is really exciting, and I loved that part of the script.
I also wanted to talk about the scenes which you have, which portray the relationship that she has with Justin, played by Jackson White, because watching the film back, you kind of see how early on he tries to control the narrative of absolutely everything. He tells Sean about their relationship without even discussing it with her, and he's always very much controlling the big things but also the small things. And there's very clear jealousy aspects in it. And I was just interested in your perspective and your experience of playing those scenes and starting to see how it really affects Whitney, because it goes back to what you were talking about internalizing certain things as well.
Mm, mm. I think women are really taught to internalize. I mean, when I think of all the things that I've been told to sort of stay quiet or like don't, and it becomes a sort of a learned behavior that we have to like reteach ourselves, you know. Um, and I mean, I have to say, I loved working with Jackson White. He's such a brilliant actor and made me feel really safe. And we, we had a great working relationship. I loved sparring off him. He's such a kind of impulsive, generous, and kind of exciting actor. So he really, really brought those scenes to life in, I think, quite a kind of rich and nuanced way. Um, and you know, uh, I think, yeah, that Whitney's, I think, talked publicly about, you know, channeling any of those negative experiences that we all inevitably face into something positive. And I just think that's a theme that continues throughout this movie.
And you also see how a lot of those experiences start to affect her in the workplace. And, she even says it out loud at one point where she's like, I'm being left out of meetings. And, we see her in a business meeting where she gets a barrage of text messages and how that, throws her flow of thought in the moment. And I was just, interested in kind of how you approach that side of her where she's someone who's incredibly confident and ambitious and smart, and yet she is also shrinking inside of herself a bit at the same time and becoming a slightly different version of herself.
I think that's what's so powerful about this script is that most women that have read it, or indeed anyone like beyond gender, when you feel related in some degree to those relationships that are unhealthy, or those relationships where you start shrinking or not being your true full self, and we're really exploring all of that in this piece. And I can't tell you the amount of times, sadly Whitney's experience isn't a singular one, and there's so many women that have read this, or people have come up to me and gone, "Oh my God, I felt really seen." And, this is a really important story to explore those issues. So, um, especially, and again, I keep coming back to the fact that Whitney was very young. And so I had to, do a lot of, when I'm making a character, there's a lot of kind of, curiosity in discovering the character, and also looking at myself and my own any experiences I might have had, and trying to bring it all to the table in a kind of vulnerable way to try and depict a full kind of person on the screen.
And one of the aspects that, is really lovely to get to see so many of those other layers of Whitney as well is the friendship with Tisha, played by Myhalla.
Mm.
And in particular, kind of seeing them at this moment where Whitney's, feeling like she's lost everything. She no longer even feels safe in her own home because she's receiving death threats. And the two of them have that falling out. Like you could just feel the emotional hurt in both of them so much. And so I wanted to ask about shooting that scene with Myhalla.
Yeah, that scene was really a really dynamic one. I have a wonderful acting coach that I work with, Lee, and we spent a lot of time talking about that scene because uh, you know, she said to me, as an actor, you can't win every scene as a protagonist. And I really wanted to, again, this is all my own interpretation, but I wanted to explore, like, what is it when you're at your lowest and you're broken? You've been deeply you're in a kind of fight or flight, you're in fear. If you're receiving death threats, if you're getting these abusive tweets, when the internet is a very scary place because there's no accountability, and which is what then Whitney sort of has fought for. But you start feeling so alone and pushing away the people that are trying to help you. What does that isolation feel like? That fear, that desperation. Looking at drinking a lot, I decided to play that scene, and I thought, well, I decided that for me, my version, I'd had like 6 vodkas already, and um, so yeah, just again wanted that to feel human and real.
In terms of Whitney's arc as well, was there quite a physical arc that you were thinking of? Because, we kind of meet her when she's got all this fresh ambition, and then we see her broken down completely at a certain point, and then we see her kind of rebuild into this new version of herself that feels even more confident than she did earlier on. And so I was really interested in just the physical aspect of playing that as much as the emotional.
Yeah, there's so many different dynamics to that. So basically, we had an amazing costume designer, Beth Morgan, and we talked very much about the growth of Whitney's fashion and how she dresses, and how you dress when you're really extremely confident. And I think there was a sense of her embracing her femininity and owning it in a space where everyone's in day gray dark suits, and she's in a kind of blonde feminine power suit, and it was like really enjoyable. I think we wanted to show a woman that's flourishing, that might have been hiding, or um um fearful of trying to fit in just to the boys club, and then like as you said, like coming out of that and sort of flourishing into this like formidable entrepreneur. So that was an arc that we discussed through costume. And then I had Barry Limo and David Williams, hair and makeup, who I'd worked with on Pam and Tommy, and I brought them on. And again, there's a very subtle kind of growth in the hair and makeup too. Um, and yeah, I for me felt that there's like a kind of um a real loss of innocence that happens, and a growth, and that actually, you know, again, like leaning into the fact that those traumas that you experience can end up giving you this unspeakable amount of strength and resilience. And that is, I think, so powerful. So there was a kind of physical shift through that too. you go through the rock bottom to come out, fighting.
No, completely. And it's also so interesting to think of this as a period piece, but it is recent period. And especially with that particular time of what technology was doing, what startups were doing, and all of the gender dynamics of everything, her pushing back and speaking out and taking on that lawsuit at a time where that was much more rare than it is even at this point was so fascinating. And what were some of the elements that you found very specific to the story because of the time where it took place?
Yeah, exactly that. So this is pre-Me Too. So I think that Whitney's story and in researching it is like it does mark a time when women were beginning to speak out more about gender, about workplaces and discrimination and harassment. But like you said, this is a movie set in the past, but it's very reflective of the conversations we still need to be having and engaging in now. I'm so jealous you have a cat with you.
He loves to come say hi when he hears voices.
Mm.
I mean,
I
it,
love cats. I had three black cats. I borrowed a friend. I was renting a friend someone's cottage over the beginning of the year, and I looked after her
oh
three
my
black cats. It
gosh,
was heaven.
that is
Hey,
so lovely.
Will.
I mean, the time period stuff as well, kind of going back to your work as a producer and what you were saying about being involved in all those creative decisions. How did that shape the approach with music? Because the music is so specific to that time period and it's done so well.
Yeah, there was Rachel Lee Goldenberg, the director, really wanted the music to be like completely time specific, and was very passionate about that to create the right backdrop and give us that time period because as you said, it's only 2012, so it's not but then but so the music was key to that and we had an amazing composer too, and I think that the soundtrack we got to it was really enjoyable. I have to say, being involved in choosing some of those needle drops and using that music as a kind of great setting, but also this propulsive energy to the film. Um, and also, what was I think quite key was in our set design and our props. Like it's crazy what those iPhones looked like. I mean, they were tiny and they kind of like the way the apps worked. I mean, it feels like ancient history because the speed of which tech and Apple is moved forward. But so that was really key to kind of setting us in that different time zone.
Yeah. There's also something that struck me in your portrayal of Whitney, which is that we see her in front-facing, public-facing situations, and we see her in very private moments. And obviously, there's kind of like minute differences to the way that she's presenting, but she very much comes across as very consistently always the same person. And so I wanted to ask about whether that was something that you kind of uncovered through your research in the way that people would describe her, or if that was a specific choice that you ended up making for your interpretation.
That's a good question. I mean, I I suppose a lot of that was born out of the research I did and looking at her. There was a great scope of interviews from early days right up until the more recent footage that we have of her, especially as she's now stepping back into the seat into that her position in Bumble, which is so exciting. I can't wait to see what she does next with the company. But I feel like for me what I noticed in her and what I think is sometimes sadly a sort of common theme is that like I think I noticed in her videos this great light and a great kind of optimism, kind of someone that leads with mission and integrity and that I think can be taken advantage of because that's what happens, but I did recognize that in her from a young age, I think, and that she's managed to hold on to that and is why she's been so successful.
No, it's so great. And I also wanted to ask about the scene later in the movie where she's on stage in the middle of an on-stage interview, and it's quite a public growth moment for Bumble. And yet all these allegations against the owner of Badoo and basically her parent company, Andre Andreev, have just come to the light, and she decides to speak upon it because I love seeing that decision of, yes, I could protect myself, but actually, opening up the conversation is much more important than myself or my individual company. And I think again, it kind of goes back to that having that moment of internal conflict, but then the decision that she does make being very different to what she would have done earlier.
Mm.
And so I was curious about what went into that scene in that moment.
Yeah, we shot that really near the end of the shoot, actually. Yeah, because that was a dramatization of a moment that the writers created in terms of the statement that Whitney had made, and then we put it in a kind of really high stakes situation so that we could feel the mounting pressure and this climactic feeling in the story of like watching the protagonist having been through so much and the highs and the lows and this great journey, crystallizing it into this one moment where we as an audience go, what are they going to do? And we kind of wanted the audience to be on the edge of the seat of like, which way is she going to go, and not know really, and no judgment kind of either way, because you could see her decision from both sides. But I felt the ending as written and in reality is what happened was felt so triumphant. It felt such a victory, you know. And I got to say, Dan Stevens was so brilliant, and we loved doing that scene in the green room prior. There was such a kind of um, beautiful tension and energy, and we shot that toward the end of the movie too. So we'd sort of built our own tension throughout, and knowing the scene that was coming that felt quite climactic, and that was one of my favorite scenes to shoot, actually.
I love that. And, kind of going back to you were mentioning earlier that as you were shooting this, that it was around the same time that you were building your production company, Paradise Productions, which you've built with Gala Gordon. And, given that you're playing a character who has such an entrepreneurial spirit and you kind of went through the process of playing someone building two separate businesses, I wanted to ask about what you feel like you've taken into the building of your own production company from playing
Mhm.
this part.
Yeah. Well, luck, I mean, again, beautiful kind of synergy or something in the universe that this part came to me at this time in my life. Um, I think, and I hope a lot of Whitney's sort of um brilliance and bravery and kind of the way that she moves the needle and breaks boundaries and what she does, and it is something that I can try and emulate and hold on to in terms of the work I want to do and the films and the stories I want to tell in my company. I'm really excited to, you know, I've been do I it's funny because I realize, it's been like 15 or maybe more years since I started acting, and I feel so grateful over that time to have worked with such amazing producers and studios and people that I so respect, and getting to now kind of take meetings with them and share these stories and ideas that we have and build them out with them, leaning on their experience and getting to sort of I just realized how much I love telling stories, and it doesn't have to only just be acting, and so it's really exciting. And I think definitely something I learned from Whitney is having great clarity on what that mission is, and how you want to contribute and how much impact that we can all have as individuals. Um, so yeah, we'll see. Early days, but it's exciting.
It's so wonderful, and it's so exciting as well to kind of be at that precipice point, and I can't wait to see what you end up creating through your company and
Thank
continuing
you.
to produce. And thank you so much, Lily. Appreciate it.
I so appreciate your time. Thank you.